This episode of No Filter is brought to you by CommBank, helping victims and survivors of domestic and financial abuse achieve long-term financial independence. Just a heads up, this is a conversation about domestic and family violence. If you or someone you love need help, please call 1-800-RESPECT. When Cathy Oddie fell in love with a man who was 6 years younger than her, she had no idea that she was about to enter her second abusive relationship. After being held at gunpoint on her 23rd birthday by her ex-boyfriend, Cathy thought she'd moved on from that, but she was about to encounter abuse of a different kind, financial abuse.
Anyone can fall victim to predators like this because that's just the nature of how insidious family violence is, that it's something that creeps up slowly. It doesn't start with the perpetrator punching you in the face.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Freedman, and you're listening to No Filter, a weekly interview podcast with people like Cathy who tell their stories very candidly and aren't afraid to be all kinds of vulnerable. And across this week, thanks to our partners at CommBank, we're speaking to three women who are ready to be very candid and extremely vulnerable about an issue that impacts so many women. 1 in 3 Australian women are affected by family violence. Cathy is an incredibly brave woman who has taken her experience and turned it into something really good. Since 2007, Cathy has been a volunteer survivor advocate with Safe Steps Family Violence Response Centre. And this role led Cathy to make a submission and give evidence at the 2015 Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence. And her testimony resulted in 2 of the final 227 recommendations, one of which led to the review of the Victims of Crime Assistance Act, which was tabled to Victorian Parliament in 2018. But before all of that, this is Cathy's story. Let's talk about that second relationship. You'd escaped a physically, horrifically violent relationship. You'd endured 10 years of stalking by that former partner. Where were you at in your life when you started this new relationship?
Honestly, when I met my second perpetrator, I'd have to say I was on top of the world. I was working full-time for Centrelink. I had returned to study to complete my Bachelor of Social Work. I just also, in my annual leave, went and spent time volunteering at a school in Cambodia in one of the slum areas teaching English. I had used my Victims of Crime Assistance compensation to actually fund that trip and turn things from a negative into a positive experience. And I'd come out of my 3rd year social work placement. So when I met this perpetrator, I was in control of my life. I was achieving goals that I'd set for myself. I had savings in the bank and I had recovered my sense of self-esteem and self-worth that had thoroughly lost from the first relationship. Yes, I was still going through health issues in terms of from the first relationship. Unfortunately, as a result of that, I now suffer depression, PTSD and anxiety and have a number of physical health problems because of the injuries that I sustained. However, I would have said I was in that space where the world was my oyster again.
And you're an advocate on behalf of other survivors and victims.
Yes, and I'd started in 2007 my advocacy journey. So this was the Safe Steps Family Violence Response Centre, and I had learnt to use my story to challenge victim blaming myths and to also speak to organisations and services about how they could improve their responses and be part of informing on the design of primary prevention resources and a variety of things that really helped me move forward from the trauma that I'd experienced earlier, and also in terms of how I'd felt so let down by systems and services. And honestly, it was one of those situations for me, because by this time I was already working for government, that I was looking at the fact that if someone like me who's educated, I'm from a situation of white privilege, I can speak English as my first language, and I don't have that many barriers in life. If I can be finding it so difficult to get help, how much harder is it for someone who's from a minority group who can't speak English, who may not be literate, and have any number of other barriers to deal with. It just got me really angry, to be honest. And that's why to become an advocate has been both life-changing and life-saving for me many times over, because to be able to channel what had then become almost harmful emotions that were affecting me, to be able to switch that around and change the narrative of that and go, you know what? I'm going to put that into changing the story and making the services and systems better and amplifying the voices of those who are not being heard. So this was all the headspace that I was in, and knowing the warning signs now, knowing where you could get help. Because when I was in my early 20s, I didn't know those things. I didn't know there were specialist services you could go to. I was never referred for assistance. I was never referred for counselling until way past that first relationship ending. So where my first relationship started when I was 22, my second relationship that was abusive started when I was 30. So I was at a whole different point of my life.
A totally different point. Cathy, how does financial abuse start? How did it start for you? Do you remember?
Definitely. So I guess it started really in that first year of the relationship, where it was probably 2 months into us being together. I was assaulted by a stranger down in South Bank in Melbourne on a night out, and that caused a neck injury. It was an unprovoked assault. At the same time, my mother became incredibly ill and I was having to do things to support her. So I actually required a bit of time off work at that stage. So the thing was, though, because I had savings at that point, I was still covering all my costs. But the complicating factor here was that my perpetrator at the time, he wasn't Australian. He was from another country.
Were you living together?
Yes, we were. However, just after we started living together, his working holiday visa expired. So technically, he was an unlawful citizen in that sense, that he didn't have any visa rights to be here and any visa rights to work. So it placed me in a very awkward position, because as a public servant, to be having someone who's not got the legal rights to be here, that could have actually impacted my ability to maintain my work. So I had that on my mind. So I had fear for my own financial security. So I was covering him for his shortfalls from the bits and pieces of work that he would get where he was doing it cash in hand, but yet again having to cover my costs. So that's where that pattern of behaviour started, of him feeling like I'm the one who has to actually cover the expenses. And that dynamic stayed throughout the entire relationship. So it then basically became that he expected a certain lifestyle that he wanted to maintain. And for him, it was very much about the things that he wanted to do, which led to the situation of me being in debt that I am now. So he was someone who had very complex relationships with drugs, alcohol, and gambling, to a level where I'd say they were actually addictions. And later on, I would also include in that his online shopping addiction. He felt that it was perfectly okay for all his money to go to all those sort of lifestyle things that he wanted to do.
What would he buy online? And would he be using your money?
No, this was a situation of his money was for him, my money was for us. So my money would be covering rent and household expenses and making sure that life could move forward. And at times when he was out of work, I would be covering his share of bills and rent. If there were points of time due to health matters or whatever that I needed some time out and maybe my income amount had been affected because I was on leave without pay, he would never do the reverse and cover me. I still had to cover myself. However, when it came to his addictive behaviours, I actually see those addictions also as a form of financial abuse, because where he would be using his money, for example, you ask about his online shopping, he'd be buying designer clothes and so forth, whereas I'd be having holes in my socks and underwear because I didn't feel I could justify buying any new things for me personally. I felt my financial resources had to be paying for the basic necessities. And there'd be times like he'd be wanting to go to this music festival or go to that sporting event. And if I'd say to him, look, it's just not in my budget right now, we've got all these other costs to cover. I'd love to do that thing, but it's just not something that I can afford to do right now. He's like, well, that's okay, I'll go. See you later.
And did you guys used to fight about money?
To an extent, but it wasn't so much about the money, it was about the coercive control around that. So, for example, if I would be suggesting that maybe it was not the best idea to do the thing that he wanted to do, let's save up and do something at a later date that we could do together and make it a special treat, he would be making threats around walking out on me. And so there was that constant fear for me that if I pressed the point, that the relationship would end. And I was deeply in love with this man. This is half the issue that you'll find with people who are in abusive relationships, that there is genuine love for the partner. And often it is, and like it has been for me in my abusive relationships, that you just want the harmful behaviours to stop. I was head over heels in love with him right up until the moment he walked out the door on me. And it was such a shock to the system. But now I've given myself a lot of time to reflect on this, because it was 4 years ago that this happened when he walked out. And we'd been together for 6.5 years. That when you're in the midst of a situation like that, it almost becomes normalised when you're within it. And it takes being outside of it to realise how abnormal these behaviours can be. And I'm actually, coming from a position of being someone who's in the sector, who advocates, yet, as I really want to reinforce, anyone can fall victim to predators like this, because that's just the nature of how insidious family violence is, that it's something that creeps up slowly. It doesn't start with the perpetrator punching you in the face.
Or spending your money. And then you look back and think about how it looks from the outside. Like, I lived in a house that I was paying rent for. He was unemployed. I had a good job. I had a car. He didn't. I would leave him my car during the day so that he could be mobile. I would catch the bus to work, and then he would drive to pick me up in my car and scream at me if he had to wait for more than 5 minutes for me to come down stairs, even though he'd done nothing all day. But at the time, you don't say, goodness, this is abusive and I'm being financially and emotionally and verbally abused. You don't say that, do you?
No. And, well, in a sense, there would be times that I would try to say that because of the knowledge of stuff that I was involved with. But what made my circumstance even more painful and insidious was he actually used the fact of the work that I'm involved with against me. I would talk to him about different aspects of what is the nature of family violence. And also, in amongst this as well, he knew, because I was quite open about the fact that I struggle with PTSD, depression and anxiety. And alongside of that, over the years, I've been someone who's cared for my mum because she suffers from severe bipolar. And so he used the twin factors of the family violence information, plus the fact that he knew that I cared for my mum, and he would use that stuff to gaslight me, and almost like a playbook of information of those behaviours, he would then enact them against me.
Can you give an example of how that would play out?
In terms of with my mum, how he would use this in sort of the emotional and gaslighting side of things is, it'd be almost like being put in a corner and poked and poked and poked. Because so he would be continually provoking a reaction and getting me stirred up so that I would actually have a natural stress response, which for me can be quite heightened because of the PTSD and so forth, because there's only so long that you can remain passive for. And I'm quite an assertive woman.
And then would he call you crazy?
Yes, exactly. And this would be exactly the thing he would do. He'd be like, you're just like your mother. You've got bipolar. And the way he would do it, it was, for me, so particularly insulting both to myself and my mum, because he's like, in a term of endearment way, you're my bipolar bear. And I'm just like,
Wow.
please don't say that to me. That is just so disrespectful. And I do not suffer from bipolar. Not that I have anything against people who do. However, I'm very clear with you about what my diagnoses have been as a result of what I've endured. And that is incredibly abusive of you to say that.
You're listening to No Filter with me, Mia Freedman, and Cathy Oddie. Commonwealth Bank's Next Chapter program is dedicated to delivering services and support to victims and survivors of financial abuse and helping them to start their next chapter. As well as the Financial Independence Hub, which provides assistance to any Australian rebuilding after financial abuse, CommBank customers seeking help can also access a specialist community wellbeing team. It takes courage to talk openly about your situation, and CommBank's community wellbeing specialists have been trained to help customers experiencing vulnerability to secure their financial wellbeing. This may include financial assistance, safe banking support, and referrals to external experts if needed. To find out more, go to commbank.com.au/next chapter. And if you or someone you know is affected by domestic violence, please call 1-800-RESPECT. That's 1-800-737-732. And in an emergency, please call 000. So, Cathy, you've got away and rebuilt not once but twice. Tell me how you've done that. How do you move on and rebuild and, become resilient again?
Okay, so with difficulty, I'd say, and particularly this second relationship, because it was at a point of where I was at a much more adult and mature stage of my life, and we've got a lot more financial commitments together. And also we'd gone through the partner visa, permanent residency stuff. So we'd had family sign off on our relationship, all these things that, in a sense, apart from having the ring on the finger, we're effectively married. So when he walked out on me in 2016 and I discovered I was pregnant, he left me 50,000 in debt. He'd been having an affair. I had no knowledge of the affair. I was completely blindsided. It was my grandmother's funeral a week earlier, and he was at the funeral talking to people about what our future together was going to be like, whereas he had already, as I know now, signed a lease for a property with the woman he was having an affair with. This was all planned. So to come home from work one evening to find all his stuff packed up and him sitting on the couch saying, "I'm leaving, don't follow me," where the day before he'd been telling me how much he loved me, it was insidious. And honestly, this child that we had actually been planning for, and it was the first time that year that I'd felt in all my years that I could actually go off the pill and try for a child, because this man was 6 years younger than me, and I wanted within our relationship to give him time to be ready, and he had said he was at that point. Though I didn't discover I was pregnant till about a month after he left. And because of just the sheer stress of all these things happening and the trauma I was going through, I miscarried that child.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Cathy.
And yeah, so that for me at the time was losing my grandmother, who I was extremely close with, losing this relationship ending, which now I know is a blessing in the disguise. But at the time, I was still deeply in love with this person and blindsided, losing a child that I wanted so much. And then being in this situation where I've got a debt to repay that's a joint loan in both of our names, and he's refusing to pay a cent. I am begging him to do the right thing. My dad is writing to him and asking him to do the honourable and right thing. And he's writing back to us just the most horrific, abusive emails, yet again calling me crazy and saying all these just absolutely disgusting things. Honestly, there were points during that, I call it, actually, it was one of my team leaders at work. I was working at a superannuation fund at that time. He coined the term for what I was going through, that I now look at that period that sort of lasted for about 2 years post then as the tsunami of shit. And and it really was the tsunami of shit, because it just kept feeling like the aftershocks kept coming and coming and coming, and the waves of
Shit.
literal shit, were just continually coming over me. And it was like every time I think, right, I've got myself another solid platform to stand on, I can move forward from here. Boom.
What have you learned from the second time?
Well, what I've learnt from that is that it's really important to reach out to services for support.
What are the best services? What have you discovered?
What I've discovered is, for example, why Women's Information are a really great service to start with, because they are there to assist women with any issue that they might be going through and provide appropriate referrals. They have a walk-in centre. Obviously, at the moment, this is a Melbourne-based service. They are based on Spencer Street. post-COVID restrictions easing up, that will probably open up again. But the other thing that Wire provides, which is really critical, is on their website, there's their web chat. They have so many different online resources that you can access, and they also can provide training to different organisations around topics such as family violence and financial abuse and so forth, so that any organisation that hasn't actually embarked on the journey of knowing how to best respond to their service users, they can engage somewhere like Wire to come in and train their staff to know how to sensitively respond. Because I think, unfortunately, when it comes to the issue of family violence and financial abuse, is that so many times when you hear those words as someone who's not from the sector, people just get immediately scared and don't know how to respond. But I always look at it as about having a human, compassionate response. Like if someone said to you, "No, I'm feeling really depressed, I'm thinking of ending things," you would then say, "Have you heard of Lifeline? Would you like the contact number for there?" If they've got a broken leg, like I do currently, and they're trying to get into a building, you would say, "Do you need any help with that?" And unfortunately, what's been the tradition with family violence is that different services and organisations have tended to really go, "That's the too hard basket. We're not here as a family violence service. We're not social workers. We don't have the time to give our staff training." And I call bullshit on that, because it doesn't matter what industry, doesn't matter where you sit, from CEO level down to being, say, in the contact centre, everyone has a responsibility. That's why, for example, once you've got the emotional supports, once you've got the legal advice, then it's looking at how other services such as banks can actually help you with your situation. And that's, for example, Commonwealth Bank has their Next Chapter initiative, and they're partnering with Good Shepherd Australia. That is something that we need to see more of, that cross-sector partnerships, to ensure that the corporate service delivery is also matched with appropriate referrals to other services such as Good Shepherd that can actually give some of those other tangible assistance. So I really applaud Commonwealth Bank for what they're doing with the Next Chapter initiative to ensure that their staff are trained, that they have family violence policies in their workplace, but also making sure that any customer that rings in crisis and discloses that they're going through family violence and financial abuse, that that information goes somewhere, that something's done with it. Because in my experience, and it wasn't with Commonwealth Bank, it was with another bank in regards to this $50,000 debt, unfortunately, this particular bank at the time, they didn't have any policy around family violence or financial abuse in their financial hardship policy. And so it took me 3 years of constantly talking to different people up different stages of the chain of command to say, what I'm going through is financial abuse. This is what has led to this debt. The stress of this is actually at times making me feel suicidal. There are weeks where I have to actually actively choose between paying a bill or paying towards this debt or eating. And unfortunately, this is where we need the way that our loan structure currently is to completely change. We need it to change actually at the contract stage rather than waiting till when crisis hits, and then legally from the contracts that we have in existence, that has been the traditional thing, that when relationship splits, whether that's a romantic relationship, a business, a family, that as long as the financial institution is receiving their funds, they don't really care what's going on behind the scenes. But unfortunately, it's a really unfair situation, because what you'll often see in circumstances of financial abuse is that these loans, very often there'll be coercive control involved. So you'll have, let's just say, the male will have the high income and asset level, and you'll have the woman who potentially will be working part-time, have dependent children, and have a lower asset base. Yet they're being assessed on being able to have a loan based on that whole asset pool. However, once that relationship ends, she's got a lot less way to service that. And if it's in the situation like I found myself, where it had just been the decision that the loan repayments came out of my bank account, the bank told me, well, we can't start taking them from his bank account unless he agrees to that. Well, he was never going to agree to that. And then I'm like, well, what are my options? And they said, well, if you stop making payments, we will then go after him. And I said, but if I stop making payments, then I get a bad credit rating. How is that fair? And at that point, as I was saying earlier, I was actually working within superannuation, and you cannot have things that are impacting.
It impacted your employment, yeah.
Yeah. And then I was saying, well, you could declare bankruptcy. Well, you cannot be a declared bankrupt and work in the finance sector. And then to compound what he wanted to do in regards to going after me, well, not only had he left me with this massive debt, which by and large, most of that 50,000 was a result of things that had come from his addictive behaviours. But aside from that, he wanted to go after my superannuation. So because we were legally in a de facto relationship, so from a family law perspective, he had a right to make a claim on me. So I get emailed, and this just at the time just was flabbergasting for me, because I was at work. This email pops up with this demand for all this information.
Oh,
And I'm thinking,
wow.
I've never given any consent to be served via email. I found that it was like, if you're going to serve a legal document, serve it to someone's actual address.
Yeah, I didn't know you could serve someone by email.
Oh, they got quite a fair bit of feedback from me from that.
Good.
Yeah, but on the day to have that pop up in my inbox at work, it started off this document saying that the perpetrator's name, wishes to reach a settlement.
So it was a shakedown.
You didn't initially realise that, because it was like, wishes to make a settlement. And I'm thinking, great, the only point of contention financially we have is this debt. So I'm thinking, I was going to do something about it. And then I read further, and it's asking me to present the last 3 years' worth of tax returns, bank statements, superannuation balance, all this stuff. And I'm thinking, why does he require this to make a settlement?
Did you have that dismissed in the end?
The advice that I was given at the time was that letter, the way it's worded, because at the bottom it says you need to respond within 7 days, but it's not a court order. But anyone who, I guess, wouldn't question that, and if your English skills weren't so good, you would feel very intimidated. I felt very intimidated by that. So they said, just ignore it. And they said, just don't respond. He's got 2 years to make a claim on this. If we can just let it go 2 years, then in regards to the debt, you could actually make a civil claim against him. So the 2 years passed. Luckily, he didn't pursue that, but he actually returned to his home country. And that then, for me, it was like, well, when I was given that advice at the time, it was devastating, because I'm thinking, it's just so unfair. And also the fact that he could walk out of this potentially with a cut of my super. And as someone who is very much involved in working to improve the gender super gap, that was something that just pushed my button on every single level.
So he didn't, right? He didn't end up getting you super.
No. So he didn't get it. But what also happened is I couldn't pursue him after 2 years in a civil situation because he was overseas.
So you had to shoulder that $50,000 debt.
And I still am. What the result of pursuing the bank around this to have a change in their procedure is, last year, finally, it was escalated to their customer relations unit. And we were able to reach an understanding after a few hiccups initially, where they gave me a very victim blaming response, and they wanted me to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And I'd been very clear with them that any outcome that you apply to my circumstance, you need to apply to anyone, current and future, and you also need to commit to training your staff around these issues. Ultimately, I can't change what happened to me, but if I can make the path a bit easier for others. So I didn't have to sign a non-disclosure. I was given a settlement of, they knocked 10,000 off the balance at that time. So I'd managed from 2016 to last year to get it down to 30,000. Aside from that, they committed in writing to actually having a policy and a training response to their staff and for their customers. And so for me, that was a massive win, not just for myself, but for all their customers, but also as an example to set for other organisations that are maybe thinking, how do I start on this journey?
Yeah. You know what you say about you can't change what happened to you, but you can hopefully make the path a little bit easier for someone else. So many people are affected by family violence in all its permutations. And I think that there will be so many people listening to this who'll be saying, oh my God, I'd never even realised that there was a name for what I'm experiencing. So thank you for all your advocacy and for speaking out. And I'm so glad that you got away from these terrible perpetrators and you're living your best life.
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. No, I'm very grateful for having the opportunity to speak today. It certainly means a lot to know that hopefully someone out there listening can be knowing that they're not alone, that there are services out there to help them. It can be really overwhelming taking that first step and asking for help. But believe me, when you do, the stress and trauma burden starts to become less. Surround yourself with a circle of support, because this isn't something that anyone should have to go through alone.
Thank you for listening to this episode of No Filter. I hope you have caught all 3 of the episodes that we've done with our partners at CommBank on the topic of family violence and particularly financial violence. If you or someone that you love needs help and this has triggered some emotions for you or a desire to reach out, please call 1-800-RESPECT. And you can find the links to the support services that Cathy mentioned in our show notes. This episode was produced by Leah Porges. The executive producer of No Filter is Elissa Ratliff. I'm Mia Freedman, and I'll see you on mamamia.com.au. This episode of No Filter is brought to you by CommBank, helping victims and survivors of domestic and financial abuse achieve long-term financial independence.